So, Scott, I know you're excited. We're going to start out right out of the gate talking about North Korea.
Perfect.
And spearfishing. NBC reported this week that they have been doing more and more of this spearfishing. And basically, these are emails where they're trying to plant malware into the computer networks of these companies, these electric power companies. Can you talk to us about who they were targeting? Did the companies, were they aware of this? When did they find out? And really, how concerned are they and are you about what's happening?
So I never want to be dismissive about a particular threat or about a threat actor, but I can simply say that this is something that happens all the time. Now, some people may gasp and, oh my God.
Is that supposed to make us feel better?
Right, no, that part shouldn't make you feel better, but what should is that it does happen all the time, and at least to this point, there has never been a attack on U.S. Electric infrastructure that has an impact on our ability to actually operate the grid. So while this happens all the time, I think our preparedness really does speak for itself. Now that said, that's cold comfort, because if the adversary has to be right just once, and we have to be right 100% of the time, we need to be preparing for that eventuality when there is a successful attack. And I can assure you that as a sector, that's something that we focus a lot on. I like to talk about the boom continuum. Left of boom and right of boom, before a bad thing happens, after a bad thing happens. So left of boom, you prepare, you protect, you detect, you defend. But you also have to look right of boom at the ability to respond and recover. And that is something that we, as a sector, focus as much, if not more attention on as we continue to prepare our systems to fight back against these advanced persistent threats that nation-state actors can perpetrate.
I understand in this spearfishing, they were not successful. At least that's what's being reported now. But this comes right on the heels of the revelation last month about the attacks by hackers, apparently, supposedly connected with the Russian government. And this has been going on since 2015 and actually targeting the control systems. And they did get in. So I mean, are we getting closer to boom? And how prepared really are you to fight this off?
So you're speaking of...
these are hostile nation states,
They
right?
are. And, there's the old mutually assured destruction framework. And so what's wonderful about advanced persistent threat from nation states is geopolitics, our capabilities, offensive capabilities as the U.S. military are a good deterrent. But another way that you deter, so one way you deter is that there is a response to the attack. That is fully a government responsibility, and I am very confident in the NSA and the DoD and the other three-letter agencies that do what they do really, really well here in the United States. The other way you deter is that the attack does not have the intended effect. So if I am a threat actor, well, gosh, why am I going to spend all of this time and resources and money to perpetrate an attack that may not have the intended consequence? So when we look at Ukraine, for example, right, which is where some threat actors have been practicing their wares.
And there has been no response, really, no deterrent. Right.
So these are my favorite kind of attacks, because they are attacks that happen someplace else, but that we can learn from here, and we are. So what we have seen, one of the interesting things about the Ukraine attack at the end of 2015 is 225,000 people lost power for 6 hours. That's a bad day for those 3 electric companies in Ukraine that were attacked, but it's not exactly catastrophic for their national or economic security. They were able to start operating their systems again in a degraded state, but without that digital infrastructure. So one of the things that we are learning from incidents overseas is, what would we do here? Could we operate the grid in a degraded state? Could we operate it without that digital overlay? And the answer is largely yes. It would be inefficient. Customers wouldn't have the control that they're used to having. Maybe we wouldn't be billing, but we would be able to keep the lights on. And if we're talking about this in terms of national security, that needs to be, that is a good outcome.
Jennings, when it comes to hospitals, I think most of us think back to WannaCry, to the Petya ransomware attacks back in May and June that really spread worldwide, and in some cases, particularly in Great Britain, really crippled hundreds of hospitals, not so many here in the United States. Talk to us about what was happening in your hospital, New York-Presbyterian, as those attacks were underway, and how did you protect your hospital and your patients' information, their records, et cetera?
Well, so our hospital has been basically preparing for these kind of attacks for a couple of years now. I've been with the hospital since 2015, And our leadership has come to view security as an existential threat to the hospital. The way we think of it is that there could be an event, a terrorist event in New York City that takes out a single hospital or a big part of Manhattan, but we'd still be up and operational in some of the boroughs of New York City, other parts of Manhattan. But something like WannaCry could take down the entire hospital system, and that would mean that 50,000 employees couldn't treat patients and things of that nature. So we've been preparing, we've been implementing advanced cyber technologies for years, and that's really why it didn't have the impact on us that it did on some of the other entities. And
So are you 100% safe there?
no, we're not 100% safe, and I don't think anyone would say they're, in any industry, 100% safe from any cyber threat. What I would say, in fact, is that what keeps me awake at night is the issues we have with securing medical devices, which are vulnerable to these kind of attacks. And a medical device is basically something like an infusion pump, or an infusion pump is a device that actually controls liquid substances that go into a patient's body. It could be drugs, could be nutrients.
Insulin, okay.
There's other devices that are radiology related. They have Windows operating systems, and we struggle to patch these. And patching is really critical to preventing this kind of attack.
But why is it so hard to patch them?
Well, it's hard to patch because there's a couple of reasons. One is that the device manufacturers actually they themselves do the patching quite often. Hospitals don't patch some of these devices like the way we do other servers, like our EHR servers. And so we rely upon this medical device manufacturer patching, and they're slow. They will claim that the FDA prevents them from patching, which is not true. That's actually just entirely wrong. The FDA has been very clear that security patching can occur. Additionally, sometimes patching can't happen remotely, so you have to do it, what we call sneaker net, where you walk up with a USB flash drive from, PC to PC or server to server and patch. And so
Doesn't sound very efficient.
it isn't. And the medical device manufacturers haven't made security part of their product life cycle.
How do we change that?
That's a good question. Over the past few months, I've been on a bit of a roadshow meeting with people from reps from the House Energy and Commerce Committee, meeting with medical device manufacturers, and basically trying to engage them in a conversation, trying to get them to care about this. At the same time, I'm working with hospitals around the country on kind of a grassroots movement where we're going to use our purchasing power collectively to force vendors to care about this. We're going to refuse to let vendors sell to us if they won't change their practices. And that's going to be a challenge because these devices save lives. They're not new devices, and we know that they're not going to be secure on day one, so the vendors are going to have to come up with mitigation strategies. But that's the approach we're going to try and take, and maybe at some point, maybe legislation will happen that actually mandates security that's necessary for our critical infrastructure.
Now, Scott and Jennings, most experts acknowledge that in both your fields, in healthcare and the electric power sectors, there is antiquated equipment, there is technology that doesn't meet the latest cybersecurity standards. I heard one expert describe it as us having an overdependence on undependable things. So if you could each play a role right now in designing a comprehensive cybersecurity standard for your industry, what would you fix first?
So I'm going to answer that question kind of holistically. So you're talking about an overdependence on undependable devices, and some of the things that Jennings was just saying I completely agree with in our sector as well. So first of all, standards to me they're useful. They create a floor. They are a regulatory approach. The electric power sector is one of the few that has mandatory and enforceable standards for cyber and physical security. Hey, that's great. But if you look at security as a check-the-box exercise, all right, I've done X, Y, and Z, I'm secure. No, you're complacent. And in fact, it's worse because you have telegraphed what your security profile is. The really simple way to put it is if I tell you, you've got to put a 10-foot fence around everything, the adversaries just bring in a 12-foot ladder. So
what do we do?
So standards by themselves are useful to, I want to make them bring that ladder, but it's not an end-all be-all. Back to my original point of we've got to be right 100% of the time and the adversary has to be right once. I think what we need is more of a mandate, and part of what we can do with our market power is to force some of our vendors to not just provide us with secure devices, but the capability, especially in our sector, I'm not sure how this works in Jennings, to be able to operate in a degraded state. I'll tell a really quick anecdote without naming names. We were talking to an enormous multinational manufacturer, brought a bunch of chief information security officers from companies in the electric power sector, and this particular provider was saying, we're going to be the industrial internet, we're going to digitize everything, it's going to be great. And the CISO sitting around the table said, hey, that's great, we love the efficiency, we love the ability to control our systems remotely, but do we have the capacity to operate manually? Can we go back to the 1960s? We operated
Okay.
We operated the electric grid for the better part of the 20th century without digital infrastructure. A great defense would be the ability to do that again. And so that's something that I think our sector is going to continually pursue. All of the digital overlay wonderful, all the efficiency is wonderful, but also the capacity to operate degraded.
Jennings, I'd like you to answer that briefly before we go to questions, but also I do think it's fascinating to point out that the healthcare industry makes up, it's the 6th largest industry in our U.S. economy, but you have become the #1 target for cyber crime. So what would you change, and in particular at a time when only 15% of hospitals actually have a cyber expert on staff, and here you are, this huge target?
Yeah, so I think you hit the nail on the head. The biggest change that healthcare needs to make is to invest in cybersecurity professionals and then cyber technologies that have been deployed in other industry verticals. You know, healthcare, I think, was hindered by the HIPAA security rule that went into effect in 2005.
Hindered how so? I thought that was protecting all of us and our privacy.
Well, that's exactly it. It really, the security standards that were that are enforced by that rule are really more about protecting privacy, and they're not geared towards cyber risk. Now, a security professional like me knows how to read those and extend those to other industry-agnostic security standards. So there's standards from the Center for Internet Security, et cetera, et cetera. We adopt those, we use those to build our security program. But it's because I'm a trained expert who knows how to do this, and unfortunately, too many hospitals don't have this. And they're also lacking basic security controls like two-factor authentication. I'm floored by how many security officers I talk to who are at hospitals, and their leadership's resisting because it'll be an impediment to patient care, and things like that. And I'm glad to say that I work at an institution that recognizes security as an existential threat, but unfortunately, healthcare hasn't realized that, and
How do we change that?
Well, I think there's a couple things. I mean, one, I think the events that have happened over the past year with WannaCry and NotPetya have really raised the alarm bells, so to speak, across healthcare. I know that the CEO of my hospital system is actually really active in trying to get hospitals to care about this, and I think the federal government could play a role if it actually would take a more proactive glass half full messaging around this, and we've talked about
regulation.
No, I don't think regulation's the answer. I actually think bringing people together, education, I think the government can do things and can facilitate things. And just in terms of my role, I try to certainly work with my peers around the country and share best practices. So I think that the trend is turning positive, but healthcare has a way to go.
All right, well, let's go to the audience. Do we have mic runners, or do we have? Excellent. Right in the front here. And if you would just stand up, please, and identify yourself so we know who's asking the question. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Li Yang. Thanks for your presentation. I think that cyber is some sort of very scary to a lot of people, and we are thinking about government is supposed to protect all the people. And we think about government before is always sloppy, and they don't solve any problem. And now we have cyber, and if they have a private contractor or cooperation with corporations, and if a corporation and a contractor working on the wrong side of the well-being of the general public, so how are we going to solve that and ask the government and corporation or contractor really think about the people's benefit? So we can really benefit the general public rather than going backward to the wild war.
So I really appreciate that question. I'll jump on it first because it dovetails a little bit off of what Jennings was saying. Government and industry absolutely have a role to play together. And whatever your vision of government's abilities and industry's motivations are, I'll talk about it this way. Government, people like to say government is incompetent in this. No. I mean, our national security agencies, our intelligence community, the Department of Homeland Security recognize, I'll use Jennings' words, that this is an existential threat. And when you then look at the private sector, again, Jennings used the word existential threat. It's something that our sector views as existential as well. There's two ways to look at it. One is the cynical way. If our equipment isn't spinning, we're not making money. So we have every incentive to protect our systems. The other is we live and work in the communities that we serve. So it's a more patriotic kind of view that we have a responsibility to the life, health, and safety of Americans. We have a role in national economic security, and I used the deterrence example. Industry has a role. We have to make sure the attacks don't have certain consequences. Government has a role. They have the responsibility to hack back. But there are other shared responsibilities, intelligence gathering, having a standing army, law enforcement responsibilities. The private sector simply doesn't have that. So if we are not working together, we are failing our public and our customers. And I think that's something that increasingly, and once again, dovetailing off something Jennings said, CEOs get that. I'm privileged to serve not just at EEI, but I serve as the secretary for the Electric Sector Coordinating Council, and that brings together CEOs from all segments of the industry across North America. It is a North American grid to work at the highest levels of government. And I can tell you that the initiatives that have come out of that collaboration have been invaluable. And I can also tell you that when the CEOs care about something, it's amazing how the rest of the enterprise does. So just as it is for Jennings, it is a priority for the Chief Information Security Officer because they know the CEO has their back, is giving them the resources that they need, and that this is something that they view as a moral responsibility, as a patriotic responsibility, and as a fiduciary responsibility.
Jennings, do you want to take a crack at it? Or?
Well, I'll just comment. You mentioned contractors, and contractors exist in all aspects of IT in every industry vertical. And we were aware of some of the breaches and issues caused by contractors, and there are some best practices that can be used to make sure that contractors can't exfiltrate data. Unfortunately, they're not being implemented. And
Why not?
Well, companies are lazy and security's hard. It's something that it takes commitment, and it takes someone realizing there's an ethical obligation to their customers and to their shareholders if they're publicly traded, and ultimately it's something groups and organizations have to be committed to, but they're not. We're seeing that with some of the things that have been announced over the past few weeks. It's just unfortunate that people aren't investing in this.
Another question? Right, thank you.
Hi, good morning. My name is Erin Dumbacher. I'm with the Nuclear Threat Initiative. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you internally and when you collaborate or cooperate with other entities, how do you overcome the fact that security is often seen as a cost center for an organization? How do you make that argument with the CEO who's not yet listening? Or how do you make that argument with a competitor that you should work together?
Probably easier for me to answer that question, so I'll let you think for a second. Okay. In our sector, we all operate one big machine with thousands of owners and operators. So the electric grid is one big machine, and we're competitive in some regards, but in others we have to collaborate. So I think that's one aspect of it. And then going back to what the previous answer, whether you believe it or not, we do really believe in our responsibility to our customers and to the local community, and we also recognize that we are critical to other sectors. But it is also an existential threat from a financial standpoint that if our equipment is devastated, we will lose that company. So our CEOs really get that responsibility both on the economic side as well as on the other. And I'll take an opportunity just to answer it one slightly different way across sectors. Everybody looks at the electric sector as the most critical. If we don't have water, we can't generate steam or cool our systems. If we don't have telecommunications, we can't operate. If we don't have transportation and pipelines, we can't move fuel. If we don't have financial services, we can't have access to capital markets, we can't trade our products. So there are a lot of ways to impact the electric sector without attacking the electric sector. So increasingly, our motivation is to work across sectors, north-south, industry and government, but east-west across critical sectors.
Jennings, I'll give you the last word.
Well, I need about another week to think about that for healthcare. No, but seriously, I have the good fortune of meeting with our CEO, Chief Operating Officer, and General Counsel like every 2 weeks to talk about security, what we're doing, our progress. Our two primary business partners are the Columbia University and Cornell University. Their leadership gets it as well. Unfortunately, many of our business partners are still coming up to speed. And so, one thing we've tried to do is really change the messaging from being focused on privacy and compliance to being really focused on the integrity and availability of the medical record, and I can tell stories about, as an example, one time where there was a hospital that I know of, they thought their blood bank system was compromised, and they were worried that blood values had been changed and that could lead to a patient dying. You tell stories like that to a hospital CEO, they get it. But that message then needs to trickle down to the, the chiefs of departments. And so in healthcare, this messaging is really nascent, unfortunately. And that's why we're seeing some of the situations that are happening with WannaCry and Petya impacting hospitals. But I think the tide's turning just in the sense that, every time I reach out, those conversations are finally starting to be easy for the first time, except with medical device manufacturers. So.
A lot of work to be done. I don't know that I'm reassured, but thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Scott Aaronson, Jennings, Aske. Thank you very much. Great.